Hi, Connor.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Doing well. How are you?
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV, and this is the Wright Show. You're Conor Friedersdorf, familiar to Blogging Heads viewers
Indeed.
as the Conor Friedersdorf, possibly the only one in the known universe. Ever met anyone with that name before?
Never met anyone with that name before.
Yeah. So it's great that you when you got an email address, whatever, Twitter handle, whatever.
All taken up.
Of course,
Yep.
it eats up a lot of those 140 characters, I guess. But
Yes.
if you opt for the full version. So we're going to talk about things including race and gender and kind of speech codes, I guess, and the virtues of shaming people, which is part of speech codes, as opposed to trying to persuade them to change their views. You've written a fair amount about this lately for The Atlantic, it seems to me. Did I forget to say that you're a staff writer at The Atlantic? I did.
Yes, I'm a staff writer at The Atlantic.
Okay, I can confirm this. So let's talk briefly about this thing that's in the news, just because it's so odd. This woman named Rachel something, who was an NAACP employee and who had been living a life as a black person and turned out to have been white for much of her life. Now, we are taping this on a Sunday. I think she's going to address the issue on Monday. This probably won't run until after that, so events may overtake us in some sense. But do you have any views on that?
Just a couple of thoughts. I think that it's as big a news story as it is for two discrete reasons that are pretty particular to right now. One of those is that social media is an environment where people are very quick to look at something that one might think is offensive, that some people might think is offensive, and to spread stories like that. And this is that kind of story. A lot of people are offended by her having done this. There's another element to it that kind of plays into the culture wars, where we've just had this moment where Caitlyn Jenner has been on the cover of a magazine, and there's been a fight between right and left about whether transgender Americans should be accepted and we should say, oh, you get to define your gender identity, or if this is actually a fixed thing and you can't actually change from a man to a woman. And so, I've seen on National Review a couple of posts of people saying kind of to stick a knife in the left to say, oh, well, she just is defining her own identity. Why is this any different than defining your own gender identity? And, I would, even though I think that this is often being raised in bad faith, it kind of raises an interesting question. I'm perfectly comfortable with calling transgender Americans whatever individuals would like to be called. But at the same time, I'm not particularly bothered by this woman claiming she was black. I'm not.
But isn't one difference that transgender people don't generally lie about the fact that, whatever that during their youth they were identified as another gender, whatever the story is, right? I mean, the deception here certainly is part of the deal, right?
Oh,
Just the fact that she got the job under false. I mean, if somebody working for me had told a lie of that magnitude, in any sense relevant to the job, I think I would not want them working for me.
Oh, yeah, that's absolutely right. That she definitely, well, it seems, at least as far as we know, she lied. Yeah. And I certainly think that people are legitimately angry. And it doesn't bother me that people are angry. But I can't bring myself.
I mean, at the same time, there is this to be said in her defense, I think. It's kind of long been said that, race. Well, there's this whole thing in academia about whether you should think of it as a biological thing or a social construct or what. But certainly, one thing that I think a lot of people agree on is that, one thing that would give you a kind of credential at the NAACP or whatever is if you've been identified, if you've had the experience of a black person living in America.
Right.
And I don't know to what extent she had successfully convinced everyone she encountered that she was black, but I guess you could say that to the extent that she has, then she knows what it's like. And at the same time, she didn't grow up like that, and that's different because that's
it raises the question of to what extent does that matter for the job that she's doing? I don't even know the answer to that. But let's go back to the distinction that you tried to draw before, because I was nodding my head as you said it. But when I think about it, if someone were to get a job at a company that I ran, and it turned out that they had grown up as a boy and then transitioned to be a woman in college, say, and this is 10 years after that, I don't think that they have a responsibility to tell me that. I wouldn't be upset if I later found out that that they didn't tell me that. And I think that I think that the transgender rights movement would say that they have no obligation to tell me that. They would say that they are in fact a woman just like any woman, and they should have no obligation to delve into this sensitive area. I think there's even an ESPN magazine story, maybe. It was some sports journalism. It might not have been ESPN, where the writer outed someone as having had a sex change operation, and this was thought to be very thought to be a bad thing.
What I had said was, if somebody told me a lie of that magnitude on applying for a job, a lie of that magnitude about something relevant to the job.
Right.
I mean, so in the case of gender, you could say, well, it doesn't really matter. I guess conceivably, if your organization were all about what it's like to be male or what it's like to be female, then you might have some kind of case. But
yes, I guess I'm not prepared to say that there is no relevant distinction here. I can think of several, but they're kind of hazy in my mind, and I would love to see someone actually spell out their thinking of this, who is on the kind of taking offense side, I suppose.
Yeah, it's a strange case. Now, you have written a couple of things about race lately that, in a way, I think there's a certain tension between. And let me just describe the pieces quickly, and then we can get into what I claim is at least a superficial tension. So you wrote a piece about this black musician who has made a point of making friends with members of the Ku Klux Klan and trying to change their views on race that way. That was by way of arguing that sometimes, we should spend more time on, persuading people with abhorrent views to change their minds rather than kind of shaming them and stigmatizing them, right? And one thing you mentioned is that, I mean, not in the piece necessarily, but you have mentioned is that, and in the case of gay marriage, we've gone very quickly from trying to persuade people that gay marriage is fine to shaming people who disagree, and you're not sure that we should have made that transition so fast. Okay, so there's that piece you've written about the merits of kind of talking about like race in this case, as opposed to doing other things. Then you wrote a piece about this academic who I think is also in Washington State, like this NAACP employee, as it happens, and she's saying that to get progress in these policing issues, especially the policing issues that intersect with race, but police brutality and so on, we have to, the phrase was something like, we have to recognize that we're all swimming in a sea of unidentified whiteness or something like that. But her point was, we have to talk about this more. Mm-hmm. And I think in that case, you're like, well, okay, you can talk about it if you want, but I don't think talking about it is really the most important thing to do about these issues at the intersection of policing and race. Right. In the other case, you're saying talking about it is the thing to do, and more than just, shutting down the conversation and shaming people who hold the wrong views. There's no contradiction between the opinions you're holding in those cases. It's just interesting that in one case you're saying, why don't we talk this through? And in the other person, there's this woman saying, why don't we talk this through? And you're saying, fine, but.
Yeah, well, so let me talk first about the article on policing.
Right.
Because policing is something that I've written a lot about for many years, and I share the frustration and a lot of the same positions as the people who are protesting in Ferguson, who are protesting elsewhere in the United States. Some of them go under the Black Lives Matter movement, and some of them are just policing reform advocates who predate that. And I've been happy that this issue that I and others have been writing about a long time is finally getting, I think, the recognition that it deserves. And I very much participate in trying to persuade people about it, and think that others should participate in trying to persuade people. I guess my disagreement with this particular woman wasn't that she was engaged in...
And her name, by the way, is Robin DiAngelo, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It wasn't that she was engaged in talking instead of doing, so much as where she was aiming her efforts to persuade. And she was making the argument, I think that the way she put it is that we need to change the water that these police officers swim in if we're going to make progress. And the particular way that she wanted to change the water was she thought that that whiteness is something that people do not do enough to interrogate, that we ought to be thinking more about what it means to be white and the kind of how that makes us relate to the world. My thinking about this is twofold, I guess. Part of me wants to say, man, it's really bad in a lot of police departments, and the kinds of things that they're doing are so far from best practices that there are just these huge, obvious things that we can do to make them a lot better. And we don't need to go off into kind of obscure theory and have this really hard, inchoate project of changing the water people swim in and examining whiteness, because we know from at least the initial tests of police cameras that these seem to reduce brutality pretty significantly, right? We know that prosecutors have this relationship with police where they have to work with them and rely on them in a lot of cases, and then yet they're the same ones making a decision about whether to prosecute them in other cases. Mm-hmm. And so it seems like structurally we could have independent prosecutors who are making these particular calls about whether to prosecute police officers for excessive force, right? You can just take down a bunch of different discrete reforms that seem to me would do tremendous good, and that if we're going to have a persuasive effort, let's persuade people about that. And the other reason for that, apart from thinking that those are where the most good can be done of people who care about this issue, it also seems to me that I can talk about those reforms. I can try and persuade other people to adopt those reforms without convincing them for lack of a better word, that the progressive narrative on race in America, the kind of overarching ideas about it, are correct, right? That's a hotly contested thing, and it's complicated, and we're never going to all agree on an overarching theory of race in America. And so isn't it better, if we can agree on reforms that would improve things without having to agree on this larger thing that we're never going to agree on. I want to say let's do that, because it seems to me that, and I don't, obviously I don't want to say that all progressives have the same notions of race in America. Obviously, there's a great deal of diversity, but there's a particular kind of a particular set of views that overlap that I think of as emanating from academia mostly, and existing also in journalism on the left. And it seems to me that they're very thorny. I agree with some of them. I disagree with some of them. But they're just certainly they're a tiny minority of Americans are going to be persuaded by that overarching theory of race. I would argue that
I would suggest that a tiny percentage might even be able to understand it. I mean, it wasn't totally clear to me what she means by we swim in the water of unexamined whiteness. The one example, she did give one example, which is she said, if we call them bad neighborhoods and call this a good neighborhood, it discourages people from going in there and, seeing these people and so on. That's true, but I think, as a practical matter, if you think parents are ever going to quit discouraging their kids from going into neighborhoods that are perceived as having a high crime rate, give it up. You can change the label if you want, but there's a whole literature showing that changing labels doesn't do much. Like if you take if you start calling janitors custodians, I mean, there's actual evidence on this that in the end, it doesn't change whatever perception there was already out there that that's a low status profession. Is not going to change in the long run. And it's like that one example of what she's talking about struck me as, it's like I just imagine somebody going door to door and like saying, could you do me a favor and quit telling your children that that's a bad neighborhood? And they'd say, well, I'll quit using the word bad if you want, but I'm not going to tell my kids to start going there if the parent perceives it to be dangerous. And so I share, maybe for different reasons, your skepticism about the value of maybe the kind of talk that I think she wants to do, although it's not totally clear to me what kind of talk she wants to do.
Yeah. Well, certainly she wants, it raises this larger question of another term that is used a lot these days in journalism and in academia is white privilege, and sometimes white male privilege. And as far as I can tell, this traces back to this an essay by a woman named Peggy McIntosh, who is an academic, and she was writing about her experience as a feminist and how she came to realize that as a white feminist, she had all of these particular experiences and what she called privilege. I think she described it as like an invisible knapsack of qualities that she could draw on. Mm-hmm. And the essay is actually quite good. I think it's a perfectly appropriate thing to have as part of a university curriculum, perfectly appropriate thing to talk about. I think that the core of the theory, you can think of many examples where I think it's correct, and I think there's nothing wrong with examining them. People probably should recognize that the shorthand that I find most useful is that being white does confer some unearned advantages. And I think that at the same time, this is true of other things too, right? Being an American confers some unearned advantages. You could think of all kinds of growing up in a rich family, right? You can think of all of these overlapping things that confer different kinds of privileges. And I think that the way we talk about this is a little bit reductive sometimes. But the bigger question I think it raises is, to what extent, when we're talking about race and trying to improve the equity of different racial groups in America and trying to improve race relations, to what extent does it make sense to focus on whiteness and asking white people to do this two-step where they both, I think, inevitably more closely self-identify with being white if they're thinking about this and interrogating it and like thinking deeply about this? To what extent, I just said that I think that it's a useful thing to do, and I'm not saying we should never do it, but it seems to me to be, for some people, the focus of anti-racism efforts.
Well, what if you flip it around and just look at the other side of the coin, and rather than pointing out to the person that they're white, just say, try to imagine what it would be like to be, say, a black adolescent male, and know for a fact, probably correctly, that when you walk in a store, you're being looked at as a security risk in a way that a white person isn't. I mean, unless you're really, really careful about how you're presenting yourself and dressing and everything else. And say, like, okay, so imagine how that might shape your attitude. And you can do this all across the board. In foreign policy, you can say, imagine you grow up in this country and America sponsored a coup that overthrew their government, whatever. Right. I think that is always a useful exercise. Moral imagination. Say, put yourself in their shoes, and that's it's a less threatening way to present it to them.
Yes, it's less threatening. It focuses on creating empathy instead of self-reflection, and I would argue that empathy is a more useful tool than self-reflection. When I write about drones and when I talk sometimes to audiences about drones, I get a lot better response. I seem to persuade people more. If I tell them you should feel guilty about your role in American foreign policy, and they're not buying that. They feel like they're a very small part of something they don't really control. When I talk about imagine what it would be like if you were living in a village in Yemen, and like maybe you're not even the target of a drone strike, because people say, oh, it doesn't kill that many innocent people, and we can argue about that. I think it actually kills a lot of them. But imagine just what it would be like to hear the buzz of the drone over the house where your kids are sleeping, right? And that's something that Americans are freaked out enough about drones that almost everyone can just viscerally imagine, anyone with a house, anyone with kids, anyone can think of what that would be like. And it's much more persuasive. And in
our case, it's just concern that they might take a picture of our backyard or something, right? I mean, it's like, that's right. Freaking us out. And we may have time to talk about privacy later, by the way. But right. I mean, in these other countries, they're thinking, wait a second, that could, they could be directing a missile toward me.
So I get this. I do think that that flip in perspective, as you put it, that is the way to focus on. And I also just question. I don't actually. This author seems to think that whiteness is unexamined in our culture. I don't know that I agree with that. It seems to me. I guess we have a lot of different subcultures. The one that I am in seems to spend an awful lot of time talking about race and identity, and I'm not just talking about the things people are assigned in college. I'm talking about popular entertainment that people watch and characters on shows. I don't think if everyone in America really were to reflect on their own whiteness and to that extent to start self-identifying as white as opposed to deracinated and opposed to this kind of like ideal of individualistic colorblindness that I think much of the country has. I don't think that progressives would necessarily like the outcome for a lot of people. It isn't at all clear to me that if people started interrogating their whiteness, the conclusion that they would come to is that they're privileged and thus they need to adopt all of these political solutions that they weren't open to before.
So they might join the Aryan Nation or something, you mean?
They join the Aryan Nation, but I don't think you're ever going to get a majority of people who are going to feel guilty about their own identity and to organize their political platform around that notion. Mm-hmm. It just seems like I just can't believe that it would ever succeed.
Okay, but speaking of the Aryan Nation, tell us about this in like-minded groups. Tell us about this black musician you wrote about who wound up making a point of befriending Ku Klux Klan members.
Yeah, so I heard his story. He's written a book about this, but I heard his story on the show Love and Radio, which is a fantastic interview podcast that I highly recommend. And on the show, he was talking about his experience with the Ku Klux Klan. He was a black musician who was playing a room, and I think it was Maryland, and it was an all-white venue. I think that this was in the 70s. And he, while he was playing there, he met this guy who came up to him after his set, and this person was in the Ku Klux Klan. And he became fascinated by this and wanted to understand how it was that people basically could hate him just for his skin color. And
although this Klan member actually approached him in a seemingly friendly manner, so far as I could tell, right after the set, right after the guy had played.
Yeah.
So there's that kind of oddity, but go ahead.
Yeah, and so this began a years-long project of delving into the Ku Klux Klan, and he ultimately, through this person who approached him, he was able to interview, I'm forgetting what the ranks are in the Ku Klux Klan.
Imperial Wizard or something.
Yeah, the head of the Ku Klux Klan in this particular state of Maryland. And he went on to appear with, he went on to have a bunch of conversations with this guy. He interviewed him. He goes on to have joint news appearances with this person, and he's talking to him, and eventually he persuades this person basically to leave the Ku Klux Klan, and has this experience with a couple other Klan members. And this could be an exaggeration. He claims that after he persuaded these people to leave the Ku Klux Klan, that it ceased to exist in Maryland. And I don't know if that's actually accurate or not, or if it just would have faded away anyway. It certainly coincided with the time when this was happening. But to me, I wrote about it because generally I'm averse to shaming, and I prefer persuading people. To the extent that I think that shaming should be done, the Ku Klux Klan is pretty much the perfect example of a group that I'm happy to shame and stigmatize, right? And when I think about why that is, it's a couple of things. One, I think that of all the kinds of hatred in America, racial hatred has done the most damage. I also think that hatred is the thing that should be stigmatized, right? I think that lashing out at people and bigotry and like these are the kinds of things, not holding a view necessarily, but having hatred for others. I think that.
Wait, what's the distinction there? I mean, it's you could certainly draw a distinction between holding a view and behavioral manifestation. That seems to me in certain kinds of with certain kinds of issues an important line. I mean, what you deal with is the behavior, whether you're dealing with it through the criminal justice system or through moral sanction. Right. But what's the distinction you're talking about between holding views and hatred, and how do you go about stigmatizing hatred per se, as opposed to such manifestations as, you know, using words that are intended to harm, like the N-word, for example?
Well, I think that I think one of the reasons I'm most comfortable with stigmatizing racial hate groups is that
hate groups.
The distinction kind of collapses for me, or racial, whatever you want to call them. The distinction kind of collapses in the sense that I can't conceive of holding the view that this race of people is inherently inferior without, I mean, I guess you could call that something other than hate, but let's just say my definition of hate includes that. And so I think it gets trickier, though, with other things. I don't know if you saw the book "So You've Been Publicly Shamed" by John Oliver.
I've heard him on the radio.
Or by John Bronson.
Yeah, all the Brits look alike. Yeah, right. But he's a Brit.
He's a Brit. And he wrote a book about, he ends up talking about maybe 12 to 15 people, all of whom were publicly shamed on Twitter for one reason or another. So one of these people was a woman who's become infamous now, I guess, Justine Sacco, who basically told, I don't think an off-color joke is the right word. She told a joke.
She was the one who was flying to Africa?
Yeah.
And before she boarded the plane, she said something about getting AIDS and then said, "Just kidding, I'm white."
Right.
And it was meant as a joke.
Yeah.
And then by the time she got off the plane, there was an intergalactic lynch mob. You know, just one thing that I find striking about that, by the way, is the woman's job was in public relations. That's what kills me. I mean, you really should be erring on the side of caution with that kind of stuff anyway. But if your job is public relations, know when not to press send, lady.
Yeah, there was a certain irony in that.
Yeah.
But yeah, you know what? Certainly once everyone concluded that this was not someone who genuinely held the view that only white people get AIDS, or that the white people can't get AIDS. Right. And there was no doubt that this is a person who would surely very much love to cure AIDS in Africa if that were within her power, right?
Right.
It seems to me that this is someone who should not have been faced with stigma, which is not to say that someone couldn't say, "I don't think that you should have said that. Here are the reasons why I don't think that you should have said that. I hope next time you'll reconsider," right?
Yeah, well, this has something to do with Twitter. I mean, Twitter is just uniquely suited to generating outrage, partly because, well, there's a lot of reasons. But, yeah, I think her punishment exceeded the crime, given the fact that she did not mean anything malicious at all.
Right. And so, thinking through my own notion about when shaming should be used, when stigma should be used, I can't give you a definition that's going to fit every circumstance. But Justine Sacco is at least an example of a time when it was used, when I think it shouldn't have been, and the absence of malice and hatred is the reason. Another example is the issue of gay marriage. It's something that I've supported for far longer than a majority of Americans.
That's not hard, by the way. The wind has changed really fast on this.
It has, yeah. But it's always been an issue I've been comfortable with. As long as I've been a journalist, I've been writing in favor of it. And it seemed to me that it's an example of persuasion working quite well. I don't have a problem stigmatizing people, again, who express hatred toward gays. I think that ought to be stigmatized. It seems to me that there are at least some number of people who oppose gay marriage for reasons that are not hatred of gays, that are not, and it seems to me that those people should not be stigmatized.
Okay, but by the same token, I mean, I guess one thing I think is that the shift from persuasion to stigmatization or shaming is something that kind of happens in the evolution of norms. And I'll give you a good example. I think it's racial segregation. Like, there was a time when they argued about that. Of course, there was a time when they didn't, because everybody thought it was fine, pretty much. And then there was a time they argued. And then there was a time when Trent Lott just said something about how Strom Thurmond was right about some things, and he didn't even explicitly say, I'm talking about racial segregation, but that was it for him. I mean, the Republican Party disowned him, and at that point, a norm has moved from the point of discussion to the point of shaming. It's become a part of the culture, and it seems to me that for better or worse, that's the way norms evolve, and that's the way a norm has become a norm. And so I guess you said, well, what do you think about the Trent Lott case? I mean, you said there are people who are against gay marriage but don't hate gays. Well, I'm sure you can find someone somewhere who genuinely is not anti-black, but just thinks, in general, races have trouble getting along, and they do better if they're separated. There's probably one human somewhere on the planet who genuinely believes that, and if there is one, would you say, well, that person, and so let's suppose that person was Trent Lott. Should that person not be shamed? Or is it just part of the natural order of things that societies have to, settle certain issues for the sake of peace and harmony and then say, okay, we're done with that. Everybody stay in line?
Well, I mean, I think that there are a lot of issues that are settled and that a politician couldn't say without being thrown from office or a leadership position. I think it's perfectly fine to kick a politician out for, people are free to do that for any reason. And I'm glad that they did it to Trent Lott. I don't think that Trent Lott should have been said to be a hateful person because I don't know that he is in this case. I think, in other words, Trent Lott, punishing him seems fine to me. If the punishment is you're not in a position of leadership because we vehemently disagree with this view that you have, I don't think that that's shaming.
Okay, but somebody would be shamed. This is a space where somebody would be shamed. Racial segregation. If somebody came out and said white people and black children and white children shouldn't go to the same schools.
Wait, is that what Trent Lott said?
No, but that was the subtext was taken to be embracing the days of segregation, I think. I mean, I forget exactly what the reading was. I mean, Strom Thurmond had done a host of things. I think he opposed the Civil Rights Bill, and I think he was a segregation until well into the era of integration. I think he was a segregationist. But let's just take that as an example. I mean,
I guess what my thought here is that you were saying that surely somewhere there could be a person who thinks that the races just don't get along and that they should be separated, right? To me, once you reach the point where you're worried about there could be this one person who holds this view for these reasons that are totally different than most people who have ever held it. If we can distinguish that, then no, I don't think we have to shame the person. And they're so few and far in between that it doesn't really impose a social cost. There are people with all kinds of I'm sure you could find people with all kinds of bizarre views that we would think of as abhorrent as if we really thought about it. At the same time, we don't need to think about it. We don't need to because I think that there are costs to shaming, right? And that's part of the reason why we ought to not do it, not because someone deserves it or doesn't deserve it in some cosmic sense, if we could know what justice was or something, but because shaming has a cost on the people who are doing it, and I think it has a cost to society.
But you're not always against shaming, are you? Or are you? I mean, there are vast realms of behavior and speech in which shaming happens. I mean,
I know. I mean, look,
incest, racial hatred, and on and on.
Right.
Pedophilia.
But pedophilia is actually maybe a useful example to discuss because I certainly share the strong aversion to pedophiles and think that people who molest kids should be thrown in jail for a long time. At the same time, I think that it may be counterproductive. The particular walls of shame we've erected around this issue, I think, are probably counterproductive. There was a great article about this in Medium by a guy named Luke. Oh man, I'm blanking on his name. Anyway, he was writing about a 17 or 18-year-old kid who realized that he was attracted to children and very much did not want to act on this. And he told this to his therapist. He told his mom, "I have to go. You have to get me a therapist. I can't tell you why." And then he gets sent to a therapist, and he goes and he tells the therapist this, and the therapist did keep patient confidentiality, but basically shamed him and said, "You're a horrible person. And he, after this, started an organization to try to reach out to kids who have these feelings and want to never act on them, right? And so here we have an example of, it seems to me it's at least possible that there would be fewer people molesting kids if merely having the impulse and not acting on it and trying to seek help was thought of as something that takes courage and is an example of a self-sacrifice that we ought to be lauding instead of pointing at these people and saying, "Oh, you have these feelings that you didn't ask for and can't control. You're moral monsters," right? So that's kind of what I mean when I say that
although there you could say what you're doing, you want to de-shame the impulse without de-shaming the behavior.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think it's just an example. I think it's perfectly acceptable to shame people who hurt children, whether it's pedophilia or any other way. I just think that.
And what about people who advocate pedophilia? Should they
advocate pedophilia?
Who advocate it?
Yeah, I think that. I mean, again, I don't know that it's particularly useful to shame them.
And
but
there are these borderline cases, where people make arguments about, well, if it's a 15-year-old and there's consent, or if there's a 14-year-old and whatever. But anyway, if you want to finish that thought.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just think that one reason that I'm skeptical of shaming as a useful tool is that when people are shamed for something and it's effective, society generally believes in it so widely that it's almost like you're not doing much extra good, right? Because the people who...
But I think there are also cases where it may not be that there's such wide agreement, but it's that the danger of fissure, of social division, is sufficiently strong that the society kind of feels a need to enforce an orthodoxy. And I think race is one of those examples. And it's race is different from something like gender in the sense that no nation has ever been torn apart by a literal war between men and women, like all the men on one side trying to kill all the women and vice versa, right? There's violence, there's assault on an individual basis, but a society has never been torn apart. With race, with ethnicity, and religion, we know that it actually can happen. And, I sometimes think that that's part of the equation. When you look at what is and is not stigmatized, sometimes it's that we know we've got a real potential fault line here. Human history tells us that. And we want to make sure that people don't get gratuitously offended in a way that could spin out of control.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if you're stoking racial hatred, it's the classic case where I'm absolutely in favor of shaming. My rule of thumb is that if I don't see hatred and animus, my instinct is to not be against shaming. And I'm sure that there are small examples where I might flip the other way, but that's kind of my general thought. And that right now the problem is that we overuse shaming, not that we underuse it.
Okay. Now I do want to get into privacy quickly, but first one more question on this subject. In that the case of the KKK, the several, I guess, people in KKK whose views seem to have been changed by extended contact with this black musician. Do you have a theory as to what was going on there? I mean, was he just logically running them through the flawed reasoning behind racism, or was it just that it was the first time they had really gotten to know a black guy?
I think that it was the first time that they really got to know a black guy.
Yeah.
I think that it was exposure, and it makes sense in a way. I mean, I think that with public opinion changing on gay marriage, I think the most important piece of that was probably increasing the number of gay people who came out of the closet, and suddenly people were confronted with actual humans instead of their prior notions.
People they already knew and liked. That was the distinctive thing about this. That can't happen with race. You know, with the exception of this one woman who works for the NAACP, you know who is black and who is white.
Right.
And it's not like you're going to go, oh, we've been friends for 10 years. I didn't realize you were black. Whereas that can happen with gay people, and I think that is exactly what happened, and that's why I wanted to kind of challenge you a little. You previously referred to that as a case of the success of persuasion. Uh-huh. I think it had more to do with the human instinct for getting along with people that, when getting along with them makes sense. You know, people that you've become friends with, people you can do business with. I think people are willing to adjust their beliefs to some extent to facilitate, you know, the kind of win-win social games that they're accustomed to playing. So I'm not sure that was so much a case of, I'm sure logical persuasion played a role, and exercises like suppose you were a gay kid can play a role, but I kind of think a lot of it had to do with the social.
Well, I think part of the thorniness about this subject, and part of the reason why people feel inclined to shame, is that there are actually two discrete things going on, but they're related to one another and they're hard to separate. And one thing is the broader acceptance of gay people and the cessation of stigmatizing gay people and hating gay people and all of these things. And the other thing is the question of whether marriage should be something that is open to gay people. And obviously these two things are tied, because a lot of the people who didn't want gay people to get married didn't want it because they thought that there was something inherently wrong with homosexuality. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, there's this other group of people who have a particular religious procreative view of marriage. And if they're an Orthodox Catholic, they also don't think that people should be able to get divorced and remarried. They have like all sorts of other things that are just as at odds with the wider culture, but suggest that they do have this religious conviction in these particular views. So I think that to the extent that those things can be separated, I think it does make sense. I think that they are, for some people, they are separate things, and that seeing them as separate would maybe help to change people's minds about whether they must be stigmatized, because if you just see them as people who hate gays, then it seems hard not to stigmatize them. That's not how I see all of the people who are opposed to gay marriage.
Okay, quickly on this this privacy issue, you're interested in this question of whether there should be a right to privacy. Now, is that in the context of all the internet stuff and how much Google knows about us and so on, and you know, an issue that gets more traction in Europe, I would say, at least at a governmental level than in America?
Yeah, you know, I think for a long time, certainly even before the American founding and certainly after it, our notion of privacy rights was baked into the home. The home is a castle, and this was the sphere at which, you know, the police had to have a warrant to enter. The king had to have a warrant even to enter. And this is getting more and more untenable with technology, because we're holding in other words, there wasn't anything magical about the home. It was just a useful construct. And practically, it gave people a lot of privacy that they needed. And when they were outside the home and everyone could see them, they didn't have privacy anyway, and there was no tenable way to do it. It made sense given the technology at the time. Now, we not only have digital footprints that we're leaving everywhere and basically have to do to be in modern society, we also, even when we step outside of our home, it's not just the people looking at us. You know, license plate readers are a good example of this, where a city will have license plate readers in different spots around the city, and they could construct a database of where everyone is going all the time. This raises questions about personal privacy. It also raises questions about government power. It perhaps gives the government too much power, and would give them the ability to abuse it at some time in the future.
And in addition to which, of course, we now know that no repository of data is secure from hackers.
Exactly.
So anything the government knows about you, or Google knows about you, could be known to the entire world at any given point.
Yes.
And that I'm not totally comfortable with.
And so in the context of the NSA collection that has been so controversial of late, the position that the NSA takes is that they collect all of this information about all of our internet habits and the phone calls that we make, but they don't look at it, they say. They just store it in a database, and they're only allowed to look at it if at some point in the future they approve a query that happens to touch on our information. They say we shouldn't worry about it for this reason. And
technically the approval is from the FISA courts, or?
Yes. And so that's one kind of intellectual step that they're doing. Another important intellectual piece of this is the third-party doctrine that developed after Smith v. Maryland, where police caught someone who was making, I think it was obscene phone calls, by asking the phone company for their phone records of the numbers that they dialed, right? And the Supreme Court ruled basically that they willingly gave this information to a third party, and so they had no privacy interest in it, that it didn't need to be a warrant, because they knew that they got a phone bill every month with all of the numbers that they called. And so obviously they knew that the phone company was keeping track of it, and you don't have a privacy interest in something that you give to a third party. So that's kind of another thing going on in the background that has different implications now that technology has changed. So one thought experiment that I think is useful for thinking about these questions is, what if it were the case that the government developed like a brain scan? They could just point a gun at someone and just suck up all of the information in their brain. And this actually, of course, that's a little bit fantastical, but they are working on pretty sophisticated lie detector tests that would raise different questions about self-incrimination if it were to get really good instead of the crummy lie detector test that we have now. But
it doesn't seem crazy to think that you can do a brain scan that would tell you whether someone is feeling animus towards someone they're looking at or something. I mean, I think that's on the horizon.
Right. So do we agree absolutely that the government shouldn't be able to brain scan anyone? Or is it the case that we think that you should be able to get a warrant for a brain scan? Are the contents of your brain somehow beyond the touch of the government? Or if there's someone who has a hostage somewhere and they're hiding them, then do we allow the brain scan, right? It freaks people out because it's people's brains. It just people are terrified by the idea of someone reading what's in their head, for good reason, I think. And yet you can see how the logic of a lot of the ways that we think about privacy are implicated.
And interestingly, the information is not strictly speaking. Well, is it strictly speaking confined to your brain? I'm trying to think. I guess when you do a brain scan, technically you're bouncing stuff off of what's in the brain.
Right. And so
it's not that the waves are actually going out. Anyway, go ahead.
So another thought experiment that is a little bit more grounded in the real world, and I wonder what you think about it, is so say you have a hard drive at your house and you've encrypted it. And this is a very good, very sturdy kind of encryption that the government cannot break at this point. And you have the key to this encryption. And you're the only one, you've memorized it, and they're never going to break it unless you give up the key, right? And the government comes and it gets a warrant for this hard drive. And in this sense, they have a legal right to see what is in the hard drive, right? Now, if it was a safe that you were storing papers inside, they could come and take the safe from your house if they had a warrant, right? And then they could tell you, hey, give me the combination to the safe. And you could say, no, I want to exert my Fifth Amendment right to not incriminate myself, right? And this case would never go to trial, and it would not be adjudicated because they would just break the safe open. So what happens, though, when they can't break the safe open, when it is an encrypted disk? And should it be legal to have unbreakable encryption? This is the issue that is going to come before us and that society is going to have to decide. The FBI doesn't like this. The FBI is saying, we don't want Apple to build a phone that it can't give us a backdoor into because we have a legal right to see some information, and they should accommodate that right.
This came up in the 90s with the Clinton administration with the so-called Clipper chip. You're maybe too young to remember that, but that was like a big issue, and they said, we want a backdoor to every computer. That was before smartphones. Yeah, it will. It will come up, and
as you were saying, we've seen that the government can't design a database that can't be hacked. So if we're building in this backdoor for the FBI, people like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and civil liberties organizations say, well, of course, it's not just a backdoor for the FBI. There are going to be Chinese hackers that figure out how to get in. There are going to be Russian hackers that figure out how to get in. There's going to be all kinds of people that maybe are going to exploit this same thing. And so, no, we should be able to have the right to encryption. And so the right to encryption is really the question. Should Americans have the right to encrypt their private information?
Well, what the government will try to do is tell you that if they don't have this kind of power, something apocalyptic will happen, and maybe they can make that case. But right now, if you look at, the kinds of things that they try to track down, kinds of crimes they try to prevent, doing things like this, they're relatively small scale in the scheme of things. I mean, look, it's terrible if somebody goes and shoots up a shopping mall, but that's not the same as saying, this is somebody who's going to blow up the whole planet. And America needs to ask, well, is it worth? And this is, I think sometimes the debate is just not really put candidly. Like, yeah, okay, there is a trade-off. I will acknowledge there's some trade-off of security. I just think the terms of the trade-off tend to be wildly overstated by the people who want to compromise the privacy. And look, it is horrible if 12 people die at a shopping center, but if that happens like every 3 years, and the price and what you get in exchange is a whole level of security in your own privacy, I think I would argue that that's worth it.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly with you on that. And it seems to me that we're using these tools mostly to fight an unwinnable drug war anyway. I think another concern I have about these, a lot of the privacy controversies that have come up, is that it isn't even as if we had a debate about what degree of privacy the government ought to respect or intrude upon. They just started doing these sweeping programs without telling anyone. And the secretiveness certainly upset people. It seems to me that it should upset people more that the kinds of programs that Snowden revealed are proper political questions of whether we want our government to do this. And I think that it is directly at odds with our democratic system of government to have a public that isn't meaningfully able to participate in self-government. We had not every member of Congress knew about some of these things as that they were going on. And so certainly even people's elected representatives didn't know about it. And the elected representatives that did, as a resident of California, Dianne Feinstein is my senator. How am I to decide if I should reelect her if I don't know some of the most important things that she's doing during her time in office? It just seems to me that if you're going to have, I understand the national security voices saying, well, there's a value for us in doing these things in secret. And I can't argue with that. There absolutely is. It just seems to me fundamentally at odds with self-government. And I don't think that that it's a value that we can extract without changing the whole nature of our system in a way that's more radical than people are really noticing.
It may be the one reason people don't resist this more is that in the commercial realm, in dealing with Google and so on, mm-hmm. a lot of them have gotten used to surrendering quite a bit of personal data, some of them unknowingly, but some of them saying, yeah, it's worth it if Google can save me time in various ways and steer me to things that I genuinely want to buy and in many other ways. I mean, when you think about it, what's slowly happening with Google, with Siri, but also with, what is it, Google Now is the Google version of Siri. Yeah. And it's becoming a kind of an artificial intelligence. It's becoming that it's like you're walking around with this person you can talk to, and you can ask them factual questions, and you can ask for movie recommendations and all kinds of things. And one reason it functions so well is because they know so much about you. And I think a lot of people are going to find that a deal worth taking. And maybe not give sufficient thought to the aforementioned fact that at any given point, some hacker could take all of this public.
Right. Yeah.
But that, I think that's related. It may be warming people up to the idea of the government having a lot of stuff.
And interestingly, in Germany, a country you would think would be most sensitive to government overreach, given their history of both the Nazi era and the Stasi era, and kind of unprecedented spying, at least in a Western country. They're more concerned about the corporations than their government. Now, this is partly because they view the United States as this big, unstoppable force that they can't do anything about all the information being collected anyway. But it's also
these are American corporations by and large.
Right, but it's also even apart from that, they have a sensitivity to corporations collecting data that again was implicated in their history in different ways. But they would say that Google should be forced to. Privacy activists in Germany, the big thing that they push for, their biggest cause, isn't getting government out of the way. It's data retention laws. In other words, they want to force companies like Google to erase all the information that they have on someone, either after 2 years, some people say, or some people say if you exert your right to have your data erased, right? And this is what they would push. They think that it's too dangerous to have this much information, in other words, this much power in anyone's hands. And so there needs to be a law to just force people to get rid of it.
Yeah, well, where these two issues kind of merge, I mean, the commercial sector and the government sector, is in this recent kind of compromise. I was paying no attention to this. I know nothing about it, but I gather I was really distracted at the time. This kind of compromise on the Patriot Act is the deal that instead of the government collecting all the metadata about us, corporations are going to collect it and then keep it, and then if the government gets a warrant, it can get it? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, so...
And I'm like, what's the difference? I don't see a huge difference there if the process, if the warrant process, if the getting permission process is the same. I mean, it makes it a little less likely that the government can cut corners. That's right. Of some value, but I don't see a huge qualitative difference here.
Yeah. So, I mean, one tricky thing is the phone companies the phone companies have their own reasons for keeping this data, right? In other words, if you have a billing dispute, right, and maybe it's the bill that's 3 cycles ago, it just makes sense for them to store these, to analyze their networks to see where people are calling and where to make investments. It just makes sense for them. They would keep it even if the government wasn't, in fact, forcing them to, right? And so we've returned to the status quo where the phone companies are keeping this information, and it does make it a little bit less likely because there's an extra paper trail step, and so it makes it less likely that someone, one thing that always frustrates me with people who say, of course, the NSA isn't going to abuse this information. It's like, well, you didn't think Snowden was going to do what he did at the NSA. He could have as easily been someone who is going to go in without you knowing and abuse the information rather than going in and taking it overseas and giving it to Glenn Greenwald, right? Who even knows if they're able to track what other people did with his level of authorizations? Who knows what Keith Alexander, when he was the head of the NSA, could have done? There was one case that the NSA called a mistake. This was one of the ones that they reported when they were saying, oh, we haven't made very many errors, and here they all are, and we reported them to the FISA court. One of them was they said they were trying to query all phone numbers from Egypt, and the country code was 215. I may have these numbers wrong, but then instead they put in 15, the city code for Washington, D.C. Whatever it was, what they put in was the code for Washington, D.C., and what they returned was just all the calls from Washington, D.C., right? How convenient if you can just describe that. The very thing you would do if you had a nefarious plot to map, what political leaders were doing. That's if that's the kind of mistake that you can make, and just to say, wave it away as I just put the wrong digit in, then we shouldn't have the government holding this interest. So that's the kind of thing. Maybe that is a virtue.
Maybe it does give us a degree of insulation. Well, we're approaching the 1 hour mark, believe it or not. How time flies, so we should probably give our audience a break. But thank you, Conor, for taking the time especially on a weekend. Everyone should read your stuff at The Atlantic.
Thank you.
Everyone should follow you on Twitter, where your Twitter handle is actually not Conor Friedersdorf, although surely that was available, right? What is your Twitter handle?
It's Conor64.
Is that your birth date or something? No, it's not. No. You're too young. What is it?
It's just a number after Conor.
Well, that I could have told you that, Conor.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, take care.